Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about a very intriguing and disturbing behavior that some ants exhibit: enslaving other ants. Yes, you heard that right. Some ants are actually slave makers, meaning they raid the colonies of other ants, capture their workers, and force them to work for them. How does this happen? Why does this happen? And what are the consequences of this practice? Let's find out. But before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. First of all, we need to understand that not all ants are the same. There are more than 12,000 species of ants in the world, and they have different lifestyles, diets, and social structures. Some ants are peaceful and cooperative, while others are aggressive and competitive. Some ants are specialists, meaning they have a narrow range of food sources and habitats, while others are generalists, meaning they can adapt to different environments and resources. Some ants are monogamous, meaning they have one queen per colony, while others are polygamous, meaning they have multiple queens per colony. The ants that engage in slave making belong to a group called the doulotic ants, which comes from the Latin word doulosis, meaning slavery. There are about 50 species of doulotic ants in the world, and they can be divided into two categories: obligate and facultative. Obligate slave makers are completely dependent on their slaves for survival. They cannot perform any tasks other than raiding and fighting. They have lost the ability to feed themselves, clean themselves, or take care of their brood. They rely on their slaves to do everything for them. Facultative slave makers are not as extreme. They can perform some basic tasks on their own, but they still prefer to have slaves to help them with their chores. So, how do these ants enslave other ants? Well, it depends on the species. Some slave makers use deception and infiltration. They send scouts to find a suitable target colony, usually one that belongs to a closely related species. Then, they sneak into the colony and either kill or replace the queen. They also spread their own chemical scent over the colony to mask their identity. The workers of the target colony then accept the invaders as their own and start working for them. This is called social parasitism. An example of a social parasite is the Amazon ant Polyergus rufescens, which enslaves several species of Formica ants in Europe and North America. Other slave makers use brute force and violence. They launch massive attacks on neighboring colonies, killing or driving away the defenders. They then search for the brood chambers, where they find eggs, larvae, and pupae of the target species. They grab as many as they can and carry them back to their own colony. The stolen brood then hatches in the slave maker's nest and becomes their slave. This is called brood parasitism. An example of a brood parasite is the red fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, which enslaves several species of Solenopsis ants in South America and North America. Why do these ants enslave other ants? Well, there are several possible reasons. One is that having slaves gives them an advantage over other colonies. Slaves can increase the productivity and efficiency of the colony by performing tasks that the slave makers cannot or do not want to do. Slaves can also increase the defense and offense of the colony by fighting alongside or instead of the slave makers. Slaves can also increase the reproductive success of the colony by taking care of the queen and her offspring. Another possible reason is that enslaving other ants is an adaptation to a harsh environment. Some slave makers live in areas where resources are scarce and competition is high. By raiding other colonies, they could obtain more food, space, and workers without having to invest in their own production. This way, they can save energy and time that they can use for other purposes. Another possible reason is that enslaving other ants is simply a result of genetic drift. Some slave makers may have originated from mutations or hybridizations that gave them a tendency or ability to exploit other ants. These traits may have been passed on to their descendants and become fixed in their population over time. What are the consequences of this practice? Well, for the slave makers, enslaving other ants can be beneficial or detrimental depending on the situation. On one hand, having slaves can increase their fitness and success as we mentioned before. On the other hand, having slaves can also expose them to risks and challenges such as disease transmission, slave rebellion, or retaliation from other colonies. For the enslaved ants, enslaving other ants can be devastating or tolerable depending on the species. On one hand, being enslaved can reduce their fitness and well-being as they lose their autonomy and identity. They may also suffer from stress, abuse, or neglect from their masters. On the other hand, being enslaved can also be relatively harmless if they retain some degree of freedom and dignity. They may also benefit from the protection and resources of their masters. And for the ecosystem, enslaving other ants can have positive or negative impacts, depending on the scale and intensity of the practice. On one hand, having slave makers can increase the diversity and complexity of the ant community by creating new interactions and dynamics. They may also regulate the population and behavior of other ants by predating on them or competing with them. On the other hand, having slave makers can also reduce the diversity and stability of the ant community by disrupting the balance and harmony of the system. They may also threaten the survival and function of other ants by depleting their resources or destroying their colonies. So there you have it, folks. That's why some ants enslave other ants. It's a fascinating and disturbing phenomenon that shows us how diverse and complex the world of ants is. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.